Hey everyone, we are excited to launch the Bright Mind subscription. Unlimited access to all of our CE courses, webinars, and expert speakers all in one place.
And for a limited time for the month of December, you can get 50% off. Normally $299 a year, now just $149 for your first year.
That's unlimited CE on your schedule for half price.
Head over to psych2practice.com and click sign up, and the discount is already applied. We look forward to seeing you there. And as always, be well, stay psyched. This episode of the Psych to Practice podcast is sponsored by PAR, where psychological assessments meet innovation.
PAR has been the gold standard in the industry for over 45 years and has empowered professionals in education, healthcare, private practice, and research with trusted tools and cutting-edge solutions.
Discover more at parinc.com. Again, that is parinc.com. Creating connections, changing lives. Hello and welcome to the Psych to Practice podcast, your one-stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insight from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm your host, Paul Wagner. Joining me as always,
Ray Christner.
And we have kind of, I think, an interesting and maybe, topical, but also there's some history behind this topic, talking about when we are cutting individuals out of our lives. And I think especially kind of focusing in on family, but we can kind of branch out. And this really kind of came from kind of a recent kind of social media push that I saw surrounding removing toxicity. And then also kind of thankfully a counter push that said, we're overly normalizing this full cutting people out or full estrangement, and how that should really be reserved for some, there are certain situations and times where that is warranted, but how normalized that has been. And it really just kind of sat with me of how often I have clients coming in either asking if that's, I want your opinion if I should be cutting them out, or I have cut them out, and talking about kind of what are the benefits of doing this? What are the risks that are involved, and kind of why is this coming up so frequently? And is it something that we should really be pushing for, or really kind of pulling back and having some other tools in our arsenal besides just, you have to deal with it or you have to cut them out?
Yeah, and I think it's timely that we maybe kind of address this a little bit, because I see it a lot. The interesting part when this kind of came up about doing this topic, I was surprised how many books in the last year are about toxic relationships, eliminating toxicity in your life. Like the word toxic just gets thrown around. I don't think you can go on social media without some feed that that has somebody talking about this idea of just estrangement from family, and it is such a complex topic. And I think that the more I see it in kind of popular media, the more concern I have. And I just recently I was traveling, and when I travel I tend to try to read news more just to keep my mind going. And there was I think it was the Wall Street Journal or one of those magazines just within the last month ago, so July 2026, that did an article about estrangement where they looked at some survey data. And it was a large number. I want to say there were thousands of people in this survey. But the thing that threw me off or kind of caught me off guard was the comment that about 1/3 of the estranged parents from the survey believed that their adult child's therapist influenced them being cut out of their child's life. And that just seemed like a really large number to me. In 30 years, I've processed a lot of wild child parent relationships for both, children and adult children. And man, I just don't think my number's 1/3. That just seemed like that was just such a high number for me. So, again, that number is only the parent's perception. I don't think there was anything in the article that established therapists actually do it, but it did make me question. And then as I see more books coming out, and as I see even professionals who on social media are talking more about it, I wonder if that's becoming more of a default strategy. And I think that, the idea of how we process that and how we think through that. And listen, there are times that it's necessary. Like, I don't think anybody's denying that. I mean, there are times that that's been the outcome of a therapy session. But I think that putting on the brakes and being more thoughtful and intentional in how we help people through that process are important, because I don't know the outcomes of estrangement are as good as what we think they are. So I think, research hasn't proven that. It's all over the map when you look at that. So yeah, I think it's an interesting kind of topic. So I guess maybe I'm kind of curious of your opinion. Like, we mentioned, both of us used the word toxic. What's your view of that word? Like, we keep having these episodes on like words matter. So
Yes.
Why not tease the word out here a second?
To maybe borrow from another word that I'm not really the biggest fan of, the word toxic to me oftentimes has like a cringy experience with it, because I feel like it can be overly generalized, and because there can be a personalized experience of it, but it might also just capture an idea without really defining it so well that it just ends up being overly used. And I would say almost in a similar sense where the term narcissistic really seemingly has drifted away from that true diagnostic criteria of narcissistic personality disorder. And when someone is acting selfishly, we can view that in a narcissistic way. And I think toxic kind of follows along that same focus. And then I think, well, unlike narcissism, toxic is not a mental health diagnosis, but in some ways it almost kind of gets used as that, or it gets thrown around in some similar ways. And I think, being able to, when working with individuals that are talking about toxic relationships, or especially toxic family interactions, I really try to break down, what are the behavioral patterns that we're seeing? Let's really try to define this. So we can refer to it as toxic, but how? What's the actual action or behavior behind it? So is it, am I feeling like there's just constant criticism? Am I feeling manipulated? Am I feeling like I'm just being made to feel guilty? Or is there a reactive anger that's kind of feeling like it's being pushed towards me? Am I being invalidated? Those are all, I think, traits and behaviors that are associated with toxic. But again, I don't know that when we're just saying toxic, that there's oftentimes one singular experience of it, other than it's negative and something that we don't want in our lives type of experience.
Yeah.
How about you for you, Ray?
I'm with you. It's interesting because it's a word that I think in the last year has bothered me, because it's just one of those words. And I recall myself using it in a situation one day and almost having a little knee-jerk reaction, wow, what's that mean? What is that, that piece of it? And, I think my reaction to it is because it's so variable. I've seen people who, their sibling irritates them and they're like, oh, he's toxic. Again, kind of a big word. And I've had people who have been stalked and threatened and have been victims of significant violence that use the same word. And I'm like, these are really different things. So yeah, I like how you kind of framed it. As you were talking, I almost kind of took what you were saying as the word toxic's a warning word about our experience, right? It's a word that we can say is, okay, it's capturing that something's happening, but I don't think it tells us what's happening. And I think that leaving it there is concerning. And I'm going to jump to social media a second, because I just over this past weekend, I was for some reason just kind of Facebook scrolling, and someone in my friend circle, I don't even want to say they're a friend, they're somebody I have a contact with. They made a post about their mother, and their mother was my mom's being toxic again. I can't stand it. Something like that. No details, which I'm glad they didn't put details, but the hundreds of comments from people of you shouldn't go through this. You should, like, it was almost like kind of overwhelming. And I'm like, they don't know what that means. That could have been their mom saying, get a job. And that was viewed as toxic. Or it could be this really horrible behavior from the mom that is dangerous. None of us knew that, but the amount of people that validated it. And so while I'm not against people getting validated, I do wonder if we validate it the wrong way, does that create more kind of fuel for estrangement down the line? So it just raised concern for me. So,
and I think an important piece is that we can't control the social media spheres, but I do think that there's almost this automatic assumption of some form of abuse when we're using that term toxic. Right. And I think we as clinicians really need to kind of like delineate and distinguish, like, okay, the abuse certainly can be toxic, but not all toxicity is abuse. And so being able to really make sure that in the session, we are kind of clarifying and we're being very specific. I think just kind of in best practice, trying to, not that we can't use the term, but I think we can't use the term in isolation, and we really need to dig deeper of, I like kind of that, it's that screening tool. It's that sign that there is concern, but how do we then take it further and really have it be better defined? Because if not, what is it that we're validating here on social media? And again, if it's, hey, you might, I think you should get a job. It's uncomfortable, but that's maybe not the worst thing to, the worst suggestion there. But again, so, and certainly kind of being able to have that nuance. And
so one of the things that, while I'm not really a relationship therapist, never claimed to be, when I do work with someone and relationship issues come up, something I say often is this idea that not every painful relationship is abusive, but also that not every nonviolent relationship means it's safe. In this idea that, when we're talking about unsafe relationships, sometimes it can be emotional. Like there are those that reach that level, but just because it's an uncomfortable relationship doesn't equal that level. And I think that's important, especially, again, the word toxic just feels so heavy to me that it's, trying to get people to think through what that means, I think is important.
And I guess along those lines, like I think trying to talk about or discuss like when we're talking about family, like family, I think inherently has a much higher risk of just being like creating frustrations, creating conflict, because, well, there's so many different factors there, but recognizing also the value of family. And I don't want to put family up on a pedestal necessarily, but I do think there's so many beneficial factors that are there. And that if we're just really quick to cut them off, like we might be increasing distress, isolation, loneliness, and aspects that maybe feel validated in the very beginning, but we end up, maybe we habituate to it, but maybe it doesn't really end up being helpful or supportive in that way. You were kind of mentioning that earlier. And I think that's an important piece of like, this wasn't my phrasing, but I really liked it of like, estrangement should be the nuclear option. Doesn't mean that we don't use it, but we do. We want to make sure like, and if we can, let's go through other steps first. I don't want to start with the nuclear option there. And, I think there's so many reasons, especially in the moment, why it can feel so valid. But again, I do want to identify like, what are those circumstances that are coming up or rising that are leading to this push for us, and like really stopping and trying to take that we as clinicians trying to work with the clients to take that third person perspective back and saying, okay, what's this overall impact, and what is it how does it influence me? And what can I tolerate and what can't I tolerate? And so being able to make it more of this nuanced conversation. And I know we've somewhat recently done an episode on boundaries. And I think that's such an important piece of like, how do we have firm but flexible boundaries, and letting that be some of this behavioral experimenting or implementing it versus let's not go nuclear in the very beginning.
Yeah. I like the idea of that. I mean, and the nuclear option, I think, it sounds really important. And sometimes we can reach the nuclear option quick. I don't necessarily think that people have to tolerate something that's dangerous for a long time. But again, I think when I read that article that I mentioned, the thing
for me when I kind of about a therapist's role in it is, are we really exploring all of that before it gets there? What's that process? And I think boundaries and looking at boundaries on a continuum is really important. And listen, that I have had people in my life that I set boundaries and they challenged them. Like they weren't really good at keeping those. But that was then me changing some other variables. Some of those people, I don't want to say I cut them off, but I don't see them very often. It's very managed. And others, I have other kind of control. So yeah, I think that's a great starting point. I think looking at the boundaries, and I think again, evaluating up front what is the danger level in the relationship, because there are certain things that we're going to cut off automatically and say, listen, you're not safe. We have to set this immediately. But also, all the great work that DBT has done on distress tolerance and looking at if the relationship's distressing, is there a therapeutic approach that we may reach prior to that full estrangement? And again, I go back to the research isn't convincing. It's while people want to push certain studies and go, oh, this shows, and when we really look at the body of research out there, it's more mixed. A lot of it's that we may have this emotional relief at first, but then the long-term piece of it. I have someone who I see for therapy who recently lost their mother and they were estranged for 20 years. The impact of that has been great and it's been a challenge. And the now consequence is maybe more emotional than what happened 20 years ago. And so, yeah, I think we have to think about that continuum of boundaries first. That has to be our starting point.
And I think along the continuum, really maybe even trying to implement like that cost benefit analysis of each and what are we predict, and maybe even like short-term and long-term. So what's the short-term, benefit, what's the short-term cost, but also long-term. And so when you have that 20-year estrangement, there is a cost, and that cost can be if something unexpected happens and there's not a resolution, how do we sit with that experience there? And there can be mixed emotions, but if there is a sense of regret, we maybe lose a significant avenue of finding maybe not full resolution, but some sense of, a modicum of resolution where now it's far more kind of an individualized work that's there.
Yeah. I think there's another piece I just want to kind of throw in. Yeah. I think as people are thinking through this, there's this, how do I want to say it? There's this feel that they have to make a decision about the continued relationship. And I just had this in a conversation with somebody that I was actually doing an evaluation on that turned much more into a therapy session. But, the individual said, I have to be decisive. And I made the comment to him, like, having low contact with somebody is not indecision. That when we decide to have low contact with somebody, it's calibrated connection. And, this idea that we can calibrate how we interact with people. And I think that's the view that I kind of view this as is how do we calibrate our connection with people? That's kind of the view. And it was interesting, again, it wasn't a therapy session, but he was like, oh my gosh, I needed to hear that. Like I needed to hear that it wasn't me being wishy-washy. And he has a significant other in his life who's like, cut them off. They're terrible to you. It's just that, and, make a decision already. And he's not ready for that. Like it just wasn't. And so when I said like, listen, that doesn't mean you're indecisive. Like a decision is made in how you decide that the interaction goes. And maybe that's the start point. And maybe that still doesn't help. And then you have to calibrate more. But if we think of it in that way, and we think about our decisions calibrates the connection, we're going to feel more in control. And I think that's important in these situations. Like control is a piece of it. Feeling like that we have a voice in the interaction. So we can do that, I think.
And it also, to maybe piggyback on that a little, like that calibrated control is a decision. And so it's kind of like, hurry up and you make a decision.
Yeah.
It's like, my decision
right.
is I'm going to reduce maybe the frequency or the duration, and I'm going to see what that experience is like.
Right.
And I really do think oftentimes, as long as there aren't any of those, I would say, kind of more immediate and emerging concerns. So maybe I should start there. Like the times in which I do think, whether it's ongoing or just at the very least immediate, estrangement is valuable. And you kind of mentioned some of these, but I think it is abuse, it's physical danger.
Yeah.
Feeling that there's not so much like just kind of like a manipulation, but almost this like overly coercive, like kind of like trying to be very controlling. I think you mentioned stalking, and that wasn't on my list, but like that, I think that certainly was one.
Yeah.
And when an individual is experiencing like a sense of like a refusal to respect kind of not maybe every boundary, but especially their safety boundaries. And so in those moments, let's create the space. But also that doesn't mean it's going to stay that we're going to keep it that way, but let's create that. But if we're not hitting some of those higher risk concerns, let's take our, like, not dragging the process out, but like, let's run some experiments there. And so I don't think this was actually ever in a recording, but you said something, and I had it jotted down here. It's like, maybe we limit it to 2 hours. Maybe we limit it to 5 minutes, and so like, we just have this kind of, I'm going to see what this is like, and I'm going to, like, if I'm making this prediction, but let me not also fortune tell. So like, I think challenging automatic thoughts of like, oh, if I go there, I'm going to have to be there all day, or I'm going to like, do we have to, or like, can we, like, what does that establish in the boundary? And part of that might be we're establishing and like kind of practicing creating a sense of assertiveness to kind of maintain that boundary, or how do we follow through even when it's uncomfortable in certain circumstances. But that's kind of this nuanced approach that I think is so valuable. And again, I think a lot of clinicians do good work with it, but I think in the social media realm or zeitgeist, it becomes that black and white of cut them out, cut them off in that way, when really the answer is far more nuanced.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, I view it as contact has its costs, right? Like, I mean, there are certain people, but cutoff has costs as well. And there are some negative things. And again, we don't know for some people what that long term is. But I think that's where good therapy comes in. Like, I think good therapy helps people see both of those columns. There's costs on both ends. And how do we, whether we use the word balance them, create harmony with them, whatever it is, or maybe we just explore them. Maybe we're just exploring both columns at the first part of therapy, but it's important. And I think, and I'll go a step further. I think there are times where, and I don't know what the research literature says on this. So I'm going to say this, and somebody may completely tell me I'm wrong on this, but I also think that estrangement is more fluid than it is permanent, meaning that there may be situations where estrangement is necessary for a time period, and that may be the healthiest option, but we don't have to view it that I can never see this person again. Instead, looking at it as that it may be a necessary reset, and it may be a way to then integrate it back slowly. And again, while that's not my specialty, over my time doing therapy, I've had people who have navigated that temporary kind of cutoff, and then a much more healthy way to slowly integrate that person back in their life, and do it almost in a desensitizing kind of way, like this gradual, like, let's start with breakfast. Let's have a cup of coffee together. And when the coffee cup's empty, it's time to end our interaction for that day. And that may just help, that may be where it's at. And maybe it never goes beyond that. But it's that, I think, that idea of some fluidity. And again, not sure on the research on that, but I think it's an important piece that it doesn't have to be permanent.
And now a word from our sponsor. PAR's AI Report Writer is an AI-boosted tool that generates comprehensive reports, including interpretations and recommendations based on scores from a wide range of popular assessment tools. Spend less time on report writing and more time supporting students. Learn more at parinc.com/AI. That is parinc.com/AI. And now back to our conversation.
And to piggyback off of when you're talking about the fluidity of estrangement, I think it can also, if the circumstance allows for it, like asking about what does it look like when we reconnect or we are coming back together? Because I think at times, if we don't have a conversation ahead of time, we can take this step, we can feel liberated. And then as time goes on, the thought of reconnecting, it can bring about, I don't even know how I would do that. Or has it been enough? And we don't necessarily define like, what is it that we're looking to get from the estrangement? And so if we set some time frames or if we set some parameters of like, what are the things that we're looking to experience? And once those are met, how do we then almost, before we ever do it, plan reintegration or reconnection in certain ways? Because I think it then helps to bring the structure rather than, well, it's been a year and then I haven't talked to them. I don't even know if they would want to talk to me, or I don't even know where I would begin. But if it's, hey, it's been a year, let me check, like, let me see how things are going. And so if we have that conversation ahead of time, I think it makes that reapproaching just feels more within grasp and reach, rather than it feeling like it becomes this needing to kind of reinvent the relationship, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, again, where good therapy comes in. Like that should be part of, and I think that's part of the discussion.
Yeah.
In no matter if the estrangement is something, or the no contact is something that's initiated, I think going through some dialogue and some kind of idea of what might reconciliation look like, and what would it look like in a healthy way? How would it look if it's not healthy? Like sometimes we try to reconcile and it's not healthy. Do we have to have complete reconciliation? Is it partial? Is it permanent? Maybe not. Maybe it's, I have a relationship in my life that is not a family member, but a friend. And it's a person that means a lot to me. But it's a person that's not a good relationship for me, nor do I think it's a good relationship for them. Like, I think it's just one of these things where we're good for a certain amount of time, and that's kind of it. And we have had moments of no contact. And now we have moments of temporary reconciliation, where it's some years will pass. We'll see each other. We spend an evening, have dinner, kind of catch up. It's meaningful to me. I think it's probably meaningful to them, but it's not like we're going to go, hey, this was great. Let's do it again next weekend. Both of us, I think, go, hey, this was great. It's probably going to be great in a few years if we cross paths. And it's funny because I was telling somebody about that relationship and they're like, well, why even talk to the person? And I'm like, just because there are differences that make it a challenging relationship doesn't mean that person's not important to me. Like, they are important to me. But the challenges that come with it aren't good for either of us. And there's a way that we found that it works. And we do some other communication, not in person, through texting or social media or things like that. But it's interesting because I've told that to people and they're like, that is the weirdest relationship. Maybe, but it's still a relationship that's important. And I'm not willing to cut it off completely because I do enjoy the time that we have, but I understand the underlying reasons why it's not good more than that. And so I think that we can redefine what that reconciliation looks like.
And I think the ability to connect is so valuable. And so if it was no contact, if there is a thought or if there is a desire to see that individual, where do you even start? However, because it might be limited,
Right.
It might be years, but it's not no contact. And in that way, if the opportunity presents itself, or if there's a thought or something that does bring it about, it's not a starting over, but it's a picking back up of where things were. And again, I think that's where it's like that can be such a valuable piece. And so something that might emulate in some certain ways, estrangement, it's just more, we take time and space in between the interactions, and that works well for us. And again, I think that's going, you've kind of shared that, but I think therapeutically, those are the types of dynamics we need to be willing to explore and discuss and talk about when it's not those crucial moments where, safety is at risk. Let's really then not be hasty in our decision making, because it is, I almost think it can be really easy to cut individuals off. And I think that has an allure to it. It's the easy button of discomfort and distress, but the lasting consequences end up making things far more challenging. And so I think another aspect, like being able to just kind of talking about the individuals we're working with and like, what are their values and where do they align? And I think values is an important piece when it comes to considering estrangement, because it's kind of the overall individual's experience, but maybe it's instead of asking ourselves, should I cut them off? It's like, what's the level of contact that, best supports my experience while also remaining consistent with my values? And so it does become less of this black and white and far more shades of gray.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that's why I think it's such a complex question. I think it's such an issue is that, and why these knee-jerk reactions we have to process through, because I think all of that, and again, kind of the example I gave, there's a value component for me, and it would, to be honest, be easier to just have a complete no contact, because there's a lot of time and thought. But I look at the boundary as a way to protect today's reality, but it doesn't really predict the future. And what I find is over time, because this person had a lot of importance in my life, I think about them. Like there's things that'll come up, and my value is the unknown is not worth it. Like I do care about them. So I value dosing it a certain way. But it also, when those moments come where I'm like, oh, you know what, we should really catch up a little bit more personally. There's a reason behind it. So,
and maybe just one more factor, like for you at home listening, that I think is important is also kind of the shock factor with certain experiences or stories, and just again being mindful of that, and whether that's coming from a cultural experience or just someone's personal lived experience that is their norm, and even if that's outside of our typical range. And I'm thinking of a personal experience. Actually, when I was younger, a really close friend of mine, when I first went over to his house, I heard both of his parents yelling back and forth at each other, as well as kind of towards him at times. And I think it would make sailors blush, some of the language that was being used in that. And I was like, how is he dealing with this? Like what? And because in the friendship, that wasn't really a behavior I had seen him, yet he would make sailors blush when he was talking right back. And so that was a bit of a normed reaction. But if like in hearing, like if he was just sharing the story, talking about, my mom said that, and for him, his experience of it, I don't think there was a personalization behind some of the language that was there. And it became then like this, profanity was used pretty liberally. And so it became like, hearing that initially, it was jarring for me. However, it was the norm, and it wasn't a distressing norm. And so I also think it's important for us to be considerate of, like, when we're hearing some of these things, let's also make sure we're exploring what is it that the other person's experience is with the events that are happening. Because if we're like, are you okay? Like, is that something that you should really be around? I don't think that we should be inadvertently pushing. I think we can be curious and asking about it without it being something that our own biases are kind of pushing for, or being like, well, I don't think anyone should, have someone yell, what the fuck is wrong with you? But if they're going to yell right back, shut the fuck up, then maybe they have it. Maybe that is a bit more of a normalized response for them.
Right. Well, I think that's important in our role as therapists. Like, I mean, gosh, reality is we are going to hear something that's outside of our norm. And it's easy to assume that it's unhealthy, and sometimes it may be, but but you're right. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that come into play. And I think that's for me, like when we were deciding to talk about this, I think that's part of the reason of the importance, because from a therapy standpoint, it's easy to get tied into the story. And, and listen, we're hearing one side and we're creating, what we think that actually looks like. And maybe at times we've even observed more than that. But jumping to a conclusion about it, we can, we cannot help, we may not help the process. We may make it worse. And again, I think, from the therapy end of this, our job's really not to help the person choose what to do. We're not trying to create a verdict, right?
Absolutely.
It's not like, oh, you need to do this or that, even if people want it. But instead, it's to create insight, and it's to get people to widen their choices and not replace like pressure or to try to create pressure on it. It's validate the pain that they may be experiencing and help them interpret it in a way that they can then make choices that are easier over time to live with. And it may get to estrangement as the right choice. Like I don't want people to think there are times I think
Absolutely.
that is it. But with all that's out there, it seems like too simple of a choice to me sometimes. It's much harder to work on our own emotional stress tolerance and how we handle that, and to set boundaries that may upset people, but like that's hard work. It's hard to tell somebody, I need a break from you. Like I need, or I'm only coming for 2 hours. And yeah, there may be a guilt trip that comes with that. Like so there's all these pieces, but I think that's, again, when we look at the therapy end of it, I think that's important. Again, I'm not a whiz at the literature in this, but the literature I have read is when individuals are in therapy, and a lot of this is qualitative data, which is great. I think some qualitative data is wonderful, but when someone is estranged and in therapy, what they find the most helpful is, one, that the clinician understood estrangement to begin with, why we have these kind of conversations, I guess. That the therapist didn't give an opinion, but really worked on insight and then really supported them in how to make the decision. So it really was this problem solving approach, and that there was not these comments that would affect that the person should think, act a certain way. And so again, it's that guided discovery, it's that curiosity that we can create in therapy that will help bring insight to people. And I think, that's not an easy path though. I mean, it's a lot of hard work, but when we do it well, we really do empower people in situations like this. And I think you can't beat that.
I guess I'm curious, like, I absolutely agree with what you're saying here. And I'm curious of, I guess, a circumstance where if someone has already arrived at this decision before ever walking in the therapist's like office, and so they're not looking at the decision, but they're rather looking at, how do I do this? Like my part of my thought goes to, okay, as a therapist, we can talk about some harm reduction techniques of like, how do you go about doing this in a way that can help preserve or help allow for that temporary space taking, or kind of setting those boundaries in a way that's going to be maybe hopefully most effective. But also, I do think there's an element of like being able to discuss how did they arrive at that decision, not necessarily to question, but to also hear the full scope of it. But I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts if clinicians put in that position there?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because I think that's probably what most people are put in. I think there are people who come in with a idea, and it's, again, people may have a different opinion. I'm not a how-to manual. So like I look at it as that, and I think I probably wouldn't say it like that in therapy, but I would kind of go, my role is not going to be to kind of say, do this, do this, do this. For me to help you, I think works best for me is to first try to get an understanding of how you got here. And like, let's maybe take a pause and let's try to get a little bit of the front end story of how you got here. And then once we have that, then let's talk about what are the steps that you feel comfortable with to get there, and to not try to talk them out of it, but not also to go, I could probably easily say, well, hey, you can do this, this, and this. This is the healthier way. But I don't know I don't view therapy like that. I don't view therapy as, let's just give you advice on the best things. It's, I think, to help people think through the approach that they want to take. So I would probably pause that. So for me, I think I would just kind of pause and go, for me to move forward, I think we need to go back, and I need to understand of how you got here. What were some of the thoughts that have gone through your mind? What are some things that you've tried? And again, not judging whether it's a right decision or not, but processing it. I can't say that I've had enough cases that I could really go, this absolutely works. But the cases I have had, when we started processing it, the conversation moved away from the how-to. And it was more, so we actually never really got there. Sometimes it still ended for them. There was still a reason to end a relationship, but it wasn't me going, here's the best steps to take. It was more them. So that's just my approach. Like I would get more into some guided empiricism and some, really kind of thinking through things and trying to understand it. And again, create some insight on some level of the decision, and then kind of probably go from there. Do you handle it?
I think I've been put in a position, and it was early on in my career, where I think I fell into the how-to out of kind of not necessarily having my own voice necessarily therapeutically yet. But I think after that experience, it felt like there's a lot of concern. And actually, I brought that up, I think, in some future sessions. And I don't even think that the individual ended up following through with that process there. But I think it's one of those things that, well, there's so many ways that we're separate from AI chatbots, but I like how I'm not a how-to, and when you said that, it just brought to mind, if I throw that into like a chat GPT or something, it's probably going to tell me, and it'll give that. And so I think the human interaction there, and the ability to say, hey, like, walk me through this so I can get the full scope of it, but also for you to get the full experience of my professional input. It doesn't work this way. I'm not an AI, like, to just ask me a question and I'm going to tell you this, but let me hear the full experience of it so we can both collaboratively make an informed decision together.
Yeah, I agree. And it really, as a therapist, is a balancing act. I think that it's dangerous when our curiosity might invalidate a person. And so we have to be careful on that too. Like that they're like, hey, I came in and I know what I want. Like, I don't need to go through this. So we have to approach it in a way that our curiosity about it doesn't invalidate their experience. And I think on the other end of it, though, I think we have to make sure that our certainty in things isn't mistaken for support. And that's where it really comes, I think as a therapist, it is so much of a balance where, it's easy, even, I think I've said something like this in a previous recording we did, but I remember when I was doing my initial therapy training, I had a professor who would have us listen. I mean, at this point, it was like cassette tapes of snippets that he recorded, and for us to watch ourselves in a mirror in how we reacted. And I mean, they were some terrible things, like things where it was like, oh my God, no one, like, people are going to say this in therapy. But it was to pay attention to our facial expressions and, to pay attention to ourselves, and then for us to say words and to see what our reactions were. And his whole thing was, even our simple, like, we raise our eyes can be validation or invalidation. It could be support or non-support. And I always thought it was such a valuable lesson in my training. Was like, I was like, oh my gosh, how brilliant that was, because I now am very aware of very subtle facial movements that I make and things especially when I'm in therapy, because again, we have to balance this. So what we say and even how we react to it, it is in a nonverbal sense can impact. And so, yeah, I just think these are tough conversations. And it's also, I think, the conversations of when we do therapy well, we really can get people to the right decision for them. And in a way that, again, research is mixed, but if by processing things with people, we can get them to not only short-term emotional resolution, but really move toward wellness for the long term based on their decision. No matter where on that continuum it falls, we've done our job. And I think that's how we should view it.
And, maybe as a closing takeaway, I think it is really complicated. And so it shouldn't be this black and do we cut them out or not? And even when there are, concerns that do warrant that, we need to do our due diligence as clinicians to investigate that further. If not, we're doing a disservice to our clients. And so taking the time to sit in the mess and work through it and exploring the short term as well as what those long-term elements are there.
Yeah, I agree.
With that, we hope you enjoyed this conversation and tune in next week as Beyond the Bot with Dr. Dan Florell and Adam Lockwood will be here on the feed as a part of the Psych to Practice family. And you can hear Ray and I then again in 2 weeks. But with that, we hope you enjoyed this episode. Be well, stay psyched.